Welcome to the Keck Undergraduate Humanities Research Fellows 2020 Spring Showcase. The University of San Diego resides on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, and I and many of us on this call today are currently in Kumeyaay Nation, and I'd like for us to encourage each of us to pay respect to the past and present citizens of the indigenous nations in whose ancestral lands we're now living and learning. I'm Jesse Mills in the Ethnic Studies Department and Chair of Collaborative Research at the Humanities Center. I hope that you and all of your loved ones are well and safe and able to follow the public health guidelines to protect yourselves and others in the COVID-19 pandemic. These Keck Humanities Fellows who are so excited to join today and to hear from and learn from today are almost done with their year-long research projects that are very exciting and that they worked very closely with their faculty mentors. And we hope that sustaining this work at this unprecedented time has furthered their inspiration and optimism about the importance and relevance of new insights into rapidly evolving human conditions. So the fellows are here with us today to present their research. The conditions have required that some of them have pre-recorded their presentations, but we'll hear from the fellows and then open up the mics and chat for questions and comments and discussion afterwards. And I have the honor of introducing our first presenter, and then they will introduce each other, the next speaker in turn. So let's get the showcase going. Alex Mueller has been exploring Southern California's landscape through her photography. She has been correlating her perspectives on landscape to the new topographics showcase, and she is now here to illustrate and explain her research findings with us. So Alex.
So before I get started, I think it's important that I first go over some brief art history to explain why the new topographics exhibition is so important and was so important for its time. Starting off with Caspar David Friedrich, who really came into play at the pinnacle of the Northern Romanticism era. His message on the left is conveyed by a wanderer's gaze into the murkiness of the sea and fog. He is showing that sublime is not just being pretty, it's a man standing at the edge of a storm. It's bringing a man and nature together in a sense where sublime is a contradictory feeling of pleasure and pain, joy and anxiety. It's a terror-causing threat that is being suspended, and in a poetic way. You move into pictorialism eventually when photography becomes into play in the 1900s, especially where they're fuzzy prints, they're being fantasized and romanticized. Pictorialism is an approach to photography that is emphasizing beauty of a subject. It's a matter of tonality and composition rather than the documentation of a reality and realistic sense. You see people being fantasized and being pictured in this kind of a way that's more appealing to the viewers and that's pulling them in. We move into the early 1900s with Ansel Adams, who's going to all these parks and shooting with his 4x5 camera. He is promoting conservation in wilderness in areas, fantasizing beautiful sceneries and depictions of nature. His photography is trying to show the viewer images of landscape away from human impact and why that makes it beautiful. So then we come into the new topographics, photographs of man-altered landscape. So this was an exhibition held back in 1975. It was curated by a man named William Jenkins. It's an assimilation of 168 photographs by 10 different photographers, and it was exhibited during the post-industrial movement after World War II. So William Jenkins describes it as the pictures were stripped of any artistic frills and reduced to an essentially topographic state, conveying substantial amounts of visual information, but eschewing entirely the aspects of beauty, emotion, and opinion. So as we go through these, you'll see how that quote comes into play. Starting with Robert Adams, you can see his images are mostly of down streets or trailer parks, rows of standardized tracks houses, and steady creeps of suburban developments that are regulated in uniformity. You can definitely see too with Louis Baltz that he's shooting over around Orange County area, and he got a lot of hate for his images being considered flat, but he argues that they're not flat, they're absence of space for the viewer to fill themselves in. He's searching for beauty and bleakness and devastation. they're all challenging the 19th century tradition of Western landscape photography by presenting the innocence view of landscape. Bernard and Hillia Beecher, they're a married couple who really stand out in this exhibition, especially for their use of grid images. Most of their images are of one architecture display, and they're taking it at several different angles. They're using neutral lighting all around, no strong shadows, quiet backgrounds, and full-size viewed. They're also the only ones in this exhibition that are using a 35mm camera, which is just a smaller film. They call their sculptures mostly anonymous, and as you can see throughout the rest of these images, that a lot of their titles are just the places that they are taken. They're not trying to elaborate on the image itself and try and distract it. They're just giving an idea of what there is. This is what there is. You move into Joe Deal, who's focusing on mundane, newly built homes around Albuquerque. He's manipulating the images as little as possible. They're pretty much what there is what you see. And Frank Golke is using mapping and flattening of land around his camera. He's conveying substantial amounts of visual information and giving the viewer what he sees. A quote from when he was interviewed about the showcase afterwards, he says, "What I remember most clearly was that nobody liked it. I think it wouldn't be too strong to say that it was a vigorously hated show." We move on to Nicholas Nixon, who is concentrated on inner city developments and skyscrapers. Most of his images are flat and free of shadows. He has no sky, horizon, or silhouettes. You can see that he's revealing endless geometric and geographic patterning. You see that there's like very little emotion in everything in all of these images. Joan Scott, he's focusing on Route 66 motels. You can see he doesn't even title his images. They're all untitled. Stephen Shore is obviously the only photographer in this showcase who is deciding to shoot in color. He says that this is, the reason he did this is it seemed to heighten a sense of detachment in his photographs in anonymous intersections and streets. We move, especially with his billboard image I wanted to touch on, is how he put a picture of the mountain in front, or the city put a picture of a mountain in front of the actual mountain itself. It's kind of ironic why a city needs to justify that instead of just having the actual scenery to itself. Then with Henry Weasel, you really see the empty landscapes and the sense of suburbia that's going against this poetic sense that other artists of the time before were really trying to grasp at. So my findings, I just want to first go into what I used for my showcase. So this is a 35mm film. It's very small, and this is what the Beechers were really using. This is what I was mainly shooting in, which is 120 film. It's a lot bigger. And then Ansel Adams and that we're shooting in 4x5s, which is a lot bigger film. So I was going around the Southern California cities, and I was shooting, I guess, in a more futuristic sense, which is due to, I mean, our era in general. My buildings come off as overshadowing and claustrophobic a lot, kind of see buildings as gentle giants. All of these images were taken before the coronavirus outbreak, I think is important, which proves that this was an issue before the world was locked inside. Throughout my findings, I found that architecture is taken for granted in multiple different dynamics. Perfect upkeeping of architecture when vacant is very important. That I saw in the cities, empty buildings that are not being used, but they're being taken care of for their outside appearances. You see so much effort and work that's just been put into such architecture and structures, yet they're not being facilitated. Nature is being used as accessories for these buildings. They're, rather than being used for environmental purposes. You see connections to looking glass self theory as well. I'm a communication major, and the looking glass self theory is when someone tells you what you are and that's what you think you are. So I kind of connected the fact that are people telling San Diego that they are a city and LA that they are a city, and that's why they're thinking that they need these grand buildings and they need this sense of futuristic cities to prove themselves. and the images you see that project yourself on others and choosing to highlight certain aspects of your identities. Is this hypocritical, manipulative, or deceptive? I would argue maybe, but then again, if for example San Diego was to reveal its outside self, then would we lose like a lot of our economy? We would lose our tourism. Would we lose that? But in reality, are we just beach bums? Are we just people who stay at the beach and we don't really need these cities? We just have them for the idea that we're a city, so we have to have that. I also wanted to touch on that most of these buildings are completely just empty, and you don't really see lots of people in the city in general. And when I was shooting rural travel, I did go out into the Salton Sea and everything, and I went into Slab City and I was shooting in there, and those pictures just didn't really grasp to me as much as those did, because they are of land and society and architecture that is just being gone to waste. People aren't taking care of it. It's just the city's letting it fall apart, which is why it's so interesting when cities such as LA and San Diego are trying to show that they're not falling apart. Are they on the verge of collapse, but they're not wanting to prove that they are. And I thought it would be important to also compare my art and my photography to modern day architecture photographers. You have people like Brad, who's photographing architecture in order to compare and contrast what the architect's purpose is. He's taking pictures and trying to understand the architect himself, and Ryan is trying to see about how nature is taking over architect, whereas I'm just basically looking at, this is what we have. And a lot of real estate and interior design photographers. I did go into a jury call, and I did an online exhibition, which I will just go into quickly. So this is my website. I have my pictures lined up here, and I have a portfolio with student work that they submitted and with short descriptions of how they see Southern California's landscape and what they think of the sublime, if you guys wanted to check that out later. However, I am running out of time. So Julia's project, to plumb rough matter using the power of painting and photography to investigate women's embodiment, is composed of 7 paintings and 12 photographs. Using theories and techniques from visual art, art history, and gender studies, she's worked with 4 women identifying individuals to produce the pieces through interview, photographic, and painting sessions. The project opens up space for herself, her viewers, to consider their generated expectations for bodies.
To Plumb Rough Matter is an exhibition of paintings and photographs. The pieces emerge from an ongoing project in which I collaborate with women through a process of storytelling, photographic sessions, and painting. And the exhibition really focuses on parts of participants' bodies that regularly draw their observation and attention. So the pieces together offer glimpses of women's bodies, and the collective imagery seeks to really illuminate the multiplicity and ambiguities of women's bodies embodiment as it is lived, observed, and mediated. So the first few images were just a few installation shots of the paintings hung in my apartment, just to give a sense of the paintings as they exist as a collective, but also in space. So here we can see a little bit of the floor to give you a sense of scale of how big they are. So you can see that the parts of the bodies that I have been focusing on, even though they might be a larger part of the body or a really minute part of the body, they've all been exaggerated in scale and color. But the forms themselves have become more attenuated. So in this image here, you can actually see just how thin the works are. And I created these sorts of mounts to actually float them away from the wall. And one impact that you're not really able to experience just by looking at them online is that when you're actually moving around the paintings, they sort of start to move with you. So it kind of promotes this more gentle way of moving about the works. So here I have created these photographic overlays that originally I had intended to print each image separately and then kind of lay them over each other and either kind of float them in the wall in a similar way to that I have the paintings, or kind of lean them as if they were on shelves on small pieces of foam core. So I'll just scroll through this really quickly just so you can get a sense. And I worked with 4 people on this project, including myself. So we have myself, my mother, Laura, and my friend Mina, and then my sister, Olivia. So this project really has stemmed out of just my interest in this genre of portraiture and just imagery of the human body, that I think now in this age of things being online and seeing all these images of mediated bodies online, I began to think more and more about how this sort of deconstructs traditional portraiture. And it also really made me think about that actual act of looking and seeing and really observing someone, and the different kinds of power dynamics that have played out throughout our history, especially as it pertains to women's bodies specifically, and also in popular culture, in commercial photography and fashion photography. And I was also thinking about how I have a very specific way of observing as an artist, but also as a woman who has been very aware of how the world perceives her body from a very young age. And this has been both a source of, power in choosing, curating my own sort of image and self-presentation, and taking a lot of pride in certain ways that I identify different aspects of myself through my physical appearance. But it also has been a source of a lot of psychological turmoil and physical discomfort and even violation. And this sort of led me into thinking about that act of body surveillance, which is this sort of habitual monitoring and kind of concern with the body's appearance. And I think that this is something that folks of every gender, this is a phenomenon, this is something that we all do. We all look at ourselves, we all, take time to manage our appearance in one way or another. But I think that there's this historical and really perpetual objectification and even violation of women's bodies that is really pervasive in our patriarchal culture and really, around the world in a lot of different ways. For me, it became really important that if I was going to be looking at other people, especially people that are close to me in my life, I really wanted to bring them into that process of representing their bodies and representing parts of who they are from this kind of exterior layer. I wanted to build a sense of trust and mutual knowing. So I began all of the processes which each person that participated, including myself, by engaging in interview and dialogue. So some of the questions that I presented to my participants were, what are some of your identities that you feel connected to and disconnected to? How are there areas of your body that feel really tied to these identities and how you conceive of them? And then I asked them to describe their relationship to their body at the moment, and kind of thinking about that aspect of time and different phases of life that really impact how we relate to our bodies and how we conceive of ourselves. And then really importantly, in terms of guiding and facilitating how I was composing the photographs and how I was interacting with them while we were in person. And then when I was alone in my studio, I asked them to designate particular areas of their body or particular gestures or movements that they spend a lot of time in, or a lot of time laboring over, observing, scrutinizing, loving, or even hating. And a lot of interesting things emerged from these conversations, just really even though it was a smaller group of people than I had initially anticipated, there was such variety in the ways, in the specific vocabulary that each person described their body. So I think that language became a big factor in how I was thinking about the painting process. And I think that these questions also really were coming from this place of understanding gender as something that is constructive and as kind of created in a dynamic process of almost like performance, as Judith Butler has sort of formulated. And so even though our identities are something that are sort of created and lived through a dynamic process, they have enormous power. These sort of categories of gender and identity have enormous power in how our bodies are perceived by others and how we look at our own bodies and how we treat our own bodies. And as the scholar Kimberly Crenshaw really importantly emphasizes, our lives flow along all of these intersecting identities and really impact, how we look at our own bodies and how we treat them. So a little bit more about my particular material choices. I decided to use this sort of thin paper. It's tracing paper or paper vellum, as some people refer to it as. And what I really liked about working with this paper is that it really kind of was like working with flesh in a lot of ways. And I know that vellum actually, traditional vellum, is actually made from different kinds of skin. And I think that it really enabled me to kind of convey a bodily feel in a way that thicker canvases or more traditional painting materials or oil painting materials didn't allow. So I was even able to really manipulate the paper using certain embossing techniques. So let's see, what's a good example? This one here. So in this here, you can see that these little bumps here have actually been raised from behind the canvas, and then from in front, or the paper, and then in front here, we can see that this indentation of a bra strap has actually been made by pressing into the paper in particular patterns, to sort of convey these sort of natural scarring that happens from this process of sort of picking and scratching that my sister spoke a lot about in her interview, but then also these certain objects that we have to wear to support our bodies through activities such as running or gardening, that actually can even leave marks in our bodies in a way that can be quite uncomfortable, and it is very distinct for I think women especially. And then in terms of the photographs, I was really thinking about, oh, they're up here, trying to find a common language between painting, which my painting is often described as photorealistic or hyperrealistic, and the photograph, and kind of trying to find ways to where they can be very similar, but also kind of disrupt our understanding of what exactly a painting is and what it's supposed to represent, and what a photo is and what it's supposed to represent. And I kind of came to this solution of thinking about the idea of layering. So in my paintings, layering is really used in a more subtle way, where you're not always aware of the hundreds of layers sometimes that go into making something feel really full in its form. But it also, all of that layering is what exaggerates color and gives a lot of dimension and movement in painting. And in photo, normally you might associate photo as something that is just a window into seeing the body in this particular way. And I liked the idea that in here, the layering provides a sort of abstraction to both of the images that are compiled, but at the same time, they really speak to the ways that our sense of who we are in the world is really fluctuating and sometimes confusing and blurry, but very, very complex, and is a lot less simple than sometimes we like to think.
Next is Cooper Kent. Cooper is a graduating senior from Redmond, Washington. At USD, he majors in Theology and Religious Studies and Physics. He hopes to go on to study religious studies in graduate school, where he will study either philosophy and religion or psychology and religion.
So I thought I'd start by saying that I had kind of the cathartic experience of seeing my research project come to life a few weeks ago. About a half mile from where I'm staying in Pacific Beach, people were protesting the stay-at-home orders with signs that read, "Make America Free Again," and "I want to go shopping." And I asked myself, what does freedom mean to these people? A year's worth of researching thought control hit me with the answer. These people are the logical end of a century of conscious manipulation designed to associate freedom with work and consumption. They are case studies and its effects, reduced in a time of trial to begging for the opportunity to put more money in the pockets of those who need it least. At the same time, interest in contemplative practices is peaking, as everyone cloisters in their homes and perhaps spends more time in introspection than ever before out of sheer necessity. In this project, I examined the history, ideology, structure of thought manipulation, in the US through the figure of Edward Bernays, and contrasted it to some insights and trends from the study of contemplative religious traditions. What I found was that the general contemplative ethos is the ideological opposite of thought manipulation, and that there is a socio-political aspect to contemplative thought that might serve to contradict and criticize a system that permits the manipulation of people's thoughts and desires. Sigmund Freud, with his view that humans are, at bottom, irreconcilably aggressive, was the unwilling progenitor of institutionalized thought control. It was Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, a revolutionary in the American public relations industry, who would come to popularize and implement on vast scales instrumentalized versions of Freud's ideas. While not many today have heard his name, everyone deep down knows Edward Bernays. His work is the reason it's important to eat a hearty breakfast, the reason there are Coke labels peppering Hollywood movies, and he's the mind behind the aptly named phenomena retail therapy. Put simply, Edward Bernays, through both the influence of his thought on public relations practices and his direct interference in the collective American consciousness, has played an enormous role in shaping our lives. Though he borrowed heavily from his uncle's theories, the two thinkers had a fundamental methodological disagreement. In his later work, Freud began developing an increasingly critical view of civilization and its progress. In his pessimism, he fought against what he viewed as unassailable misery on an individual basis, hoping to help individuals, one by one, deal with the uncompromising discomfort of civilized life through psychotherapy. But where Freud was pessimistic, Bernays was stricken with an ill-founded and foolhardy optimism. Bernays did not trust or sympathize with individuals, but he had unwavering hope in American civilization in general. Where Freud wanted to liberate people, Bernays wanted to exploit them, and he did so always for the benefit of large corporations, personal profit, and his own idealized vision of American society. Bernays feared that the world after the death of God was descending into social chaos. He believed he had a solution. Him and the other PR counselors could do God's job at least as well. Bernays and his cohort of self-appointed gods would constitute an invisible government, in his own words, that would serve as the ruling power of our country. And the masses over which they ruled were, in their view, irrational, patently stupid, and most importantly, malleable. But Bernays defined people on strictly operational terms, terms that aligned with his goals and methods. Stupid, manipulable people were useful to Bernays' enterprises, so he defined people as stupid and manipulable, and then sought to bring his definition into reality. This amounted to an ideal of democracy that was central to Bernays' work, a democracy in which the stupid, subversive, and sporadic free thinking of the people would be corralled by the psychological manipulation tactics of a small group of benevolent technocrats. Bernays wanted to turn democracy from a form of popular government into an entertaining, palliative, and powerful mechanism of control. To bring about his ideal, Bernays sought to elevate the role that unconscious desire plays in the functioning of society, and subsequently to use psychoanalytic and public relations techniques to control people's desires. His work on this task attacked on three major fronts. Bernays provided the techniques required to shift the American economy from a basis of need to a basis of desire. It was instrumental in creating a powerful emotional tie between democracy and capitalism, and helped transfigure news media into a medium of controlled discourse and persuasion. After World War I, America's wartime production apparatus was humming, but there was a growing fear among government officials and corporate elites that consumption would grind to a halt as Americans easily and satisfactorily fulfilled their limited needs. Business leaders were searching for a way to convince the American people to continue buying despite their abundance of possessions. Bernays thought he knew what to do. His method amounted to a paradigmatic shift in perspective. Rather than, as had been popular in the past, informing potential buyers about the practical virtues of some product, Bernays wanted to create consumers who would purchase products they didn't need on their own volition. He did this by pandering not to the rational element of the consumer, but to their unconscious desires, a legacy clearly observed in ads today. The psychological effect of this had on people is twofold. First, it persistently stimulates individual desires and weaves strong emotional ties between individuals and their products. Consumption-based economic models require that consumers' wants take on the strength and pitch of needs. Herbert Marcuse, critical theorist and social commentator, thus refers to these manufactured wants as, quote, false needs. Marcuse viewed the phenomenon of false needs as a powerful method of control, because on the one hand, the constant and spontaneous inflow and reproduction of false needs ensures that no one can remain lastingly satisfied. Lasting satisfaction is anathema to late-stage capitalism, so the PR apparatus must, at all times, continue to reproduce desires. On the other hand, the additional false needs carry the potential for unnaturally high quanta of satisfaction, because as the number of false needs multiplies, the satisfaction of needs, many of them false, can multiply as well. Without getting too deep into the psychoanalytic weeds, the individual psyche is thus dwarfed by a mounting pile of satisfaction, and as a result is sedated, losing its critical capacity. The vacuous happiness resulting from satisfied false needs is, in short, incomplete and pacifying, perpetuating constant dissatisfaction and robbing individuals of the critical capacity to address the irrational consumption cycle. Selling to people's irrational desires also projects emotional meaning onto otherwise irrelevant objects. We are familiar with the late stages of this effect, with the idea that things we own communicate and embody how we see ourselves. But Bernays began working on this process early in his career. The price of such advertising magic is severe. Subjective human qualities are externalized and stored symbolically in objects. In a famous PR stunt, Bernays quite literally objectified freedom in order to sell cigarettes to women, but his tactics might just as easily sell uniqueness, virtue, religiosity, social justice, intellect, love, change-making, anything. Products become parodies of the array of valuable subject human qualities and breed further dependence on the system of production and consumption, because the objects and values passed down to consumers are screened in two important ways. Very few consumable items that contain content the system sees as genuinely threatening will be available, and every consumable item will reinforce the notion that self-actualization is a matter of item and experience collecting. Even the consumption habits of the individualistic or countercultural fall prey to this system of vetting. Psychedelic drug memorabilia, Christian devotional books, Wu-Tang Clan CDs, and Che Guevara t-shirts alike have been permitted as harmless negations to a system they once contradicted. The peculiar reality of retail therapy is, beneath its surface, a powerful tool by which business interests collect profit, inculcate individuals with their materialistic value system, and objectify and neuter forms of qualitative oppression. Later on, after the Great Depression, the PR industry, with Bernays as a leading player, was contracted by big business to convince the American people that socialist workers' movements were not to be trusted. Bernays launched a years-long subliminal messaging campaign on a grand scale. Basically, he taught people to associate state-subsidized capitalism with democracy, thus fashioning an unconscious connection between citizens and big business. In a triumph of real-world Orwellian doublethink, the subjects of this persuasion could at once both define democracy as the rule of the many and defend, with passion and vigor, the rule over the many by the few, in this case, the business elites and their government partners. After World War II, Bernays was one of the first to suggest that fear of communism should be fanned to buttress the economic order. He used the word as a weapon against populist movements, and it's still used this way to this day. Bernays inculcated the American subconscious with both a fear of anti-big business politics and an idolization of big business, implanting mechanisms into the individual subconscious that could make individuals passionately and unconsciously stamp out the sparks of ideas that contradict the established system through censoring themselves as well as others. More than that, Bernays urged politicians to take up his cause, to follow the example of big business and begin employing his methods. In doing so, he ushered in an era of American politics in which rational debate on policy would be drowned out completely by the exceedingly loud public relations arms of political campaigns. Politicians, following suit with big business, made the shift from asking people to vote for them to creating voters. As a result, citizens already limited to a narrow range of approved of options would subsequently be subject to constant programs of psychological manipulation designed to bring them in line with the project of some candidate or political machine. This encroachment on irrationality by persuasion is nowhere more uncanny than in mainstream media, where PR plays such an extensive role that the line between informing and persuading is entirely blurred. Today, public relations practitioners outnumber journalists by about 5 to 4. So by sheer size of the workforce, more money and effort goes into persuading people than informing them. Not to mention the fact that PR is a multi-billion-dollar industry whose growth is outpacing almost the entirety of the economy. About a third of today's PR practitioners have journalism backgrounds, These armies of persuaders, many of whom fluent in the ins and outs of journalism, have made the corporate news media beholden to the public relations industry. Studies show that about 40% of news flows directly, practically unaltered, from PR offices. This too is a legacy of Bernays, who was the first to advise his fellow PR practitioners to co-opt and control the news for their PR campaigns. The PR industry has established itself as a source of news by cleverly exploiting economic constraints. In order to provide the enormous quantity of information that is required of a mass media outlet, news sources are constrained to relying on press releases from the public relations wings of government agencies and big businesses. It's a one-sided alliance that takes the form of a conditional subsidy. Those in power can continue to use their PR resources to help the media cut costs, but only if the media promises not to get in their way. News sources that rely on advertising funds are completely beholden to the corporation and large businesses. But the desire-based advertising Bernays pioneered superimposes additional constraints. Now the media must pander to the abstract notion of the, quote, buying mood. So programs whose content is serious, critical, uncomfortable, or in opposition to the system of production and consumption will receive little corporate support. In the last analysis, news media is run by people, and these people have every likelihood of already having been conditioned to cooperate with the established system. This combination of economic and psychological filters reinforce the established order against the potentially subversive news media, who have been incorporated into the tactics of the PR industry as a powerful means of reinforcing support for their plans. What Bernays and his descendants have created is a reality that circumnavigates the critical reason of its constituents, and, through psychological manipulation methods, co-opts their unconscious desires in service of the projects of those in power. In this climate, democracy is morphed into a means of retaining power, and the constant buzz of media and democratic spectacle is a feel-good illusion, a palliative used to lull populations into allowing the rule of the invisible government to continue. But all of Bernays' ideals, methods, and authoritarian impulses are predicated on a specific view of human nature, the view that human beings possess an ontological defect, a natural aptitude for evil and disharmony that makes them dangerous threats to their own well-being. Bernays' view, which was strictly atheistic, might be viewed as a secularized version of the theological concept of original sin. His theology, as has been shown, leads him to develop a philosophy based on a politics of invisible authoritarianism. Bracketing the theological assumption, this logic is entirely consistent. Being ontologically defective, humans require not freedom, but authoritarian rule in order to protect themselves. The fact that the issue with Bernays-style manipulation tactics is rarely taken might speak to the extent to which his theology has been implicitly adopted, likely through acting in accordance with a system that treats people as though this assumption were true. It follows
Cooper,
that
this is a 1-minute warning, okay, Cooper?
Okay, thanks. Sorry, I'll have to skip ahead a little bit. But there's another theory. There's the theory that humans are fundamentally good, and this theory is particularly common within the world's contemplative traditions. And the political correlate to this theory is anarchism, which is the view that unequal power relations have the potential to get in the way of the outflow of natural human goodness. And this pairing may seem a little strange between anarchism and contemplative traditions, but in fact, it's corroborated by a pretty lengthy history of contemplative communities living in somewhat anti-establishment and communistic societies, including the Pythagorean Society, the Essenes, the Christian Desert Fathers, as well as many others. But there is also some functional similarities that I think might provide avenues for contradicting the phenomena of thought control that include radical skepticism and emphasis on personal experience over the words of authority, both religious and governmental, and emphasis on unlearning and critical examination that might perhaps undo some of the other stuff. Yeah, so I guess I'll have to conclude, but next up is Noah. Noah is majoring in history and communication studies. He's interested in memory and landscape, and he hopes to continue and build upon his research after graduation.
So the title of my thesis presentation, first I'll get into the format of it. It's historical research paper. The final product is going to be in like a long form essay, and that will probably be available in the future for reading. But in the meantime, here's my presentation. The title of my research project is Purposely Forgetting, Surveying San Diego's Founding Narrative During the City's Bicentennial Celebrations of 1969. And so to begin, we'll go over the thesis question. This is kind of the guiding idea of the paper and the whole project. It asks, why were colonial spaces of remembrance, particularly the San Diego Presidio Park and San Diego Mission de Alcala, places of celebration for narratives of European colonization during the bicentennial celebrations of 1969? And why were they not places of healing, recovery, and remembrance of the hardships of native populations and colonial settlers? So this thesis is broken down into two sections, obviously, and the first kind of works to understand how the narrative of San Diego's founding was kind of constructed and why it prioritizes European actors. And the second part kind of talks about why is it not giving a more representative and decolonial presence in San Diego of the history. So before I get into the argument, we've divided it into three sections. The first one deals with the influence of Anglo hegemony. The second talks about market influences upon the narrative. And thirdly, we'll go into biases in scholarship in the academic community that have affected how the narrative was constructed in the first place. For the first section, again, we're going to be talking about Anglo hegemony. So my paper begins by establishing that Anglo hegemony was present in San Diego during the bicentennial celebrations of 1969. This is proved through evidence of municipal legislation that has unfairly targeted like commonly marginalized populations in San Diego, and kind of promotes and gives improper or unrepresentative power to Anglo populations. This can be seen in evidence of like municipal legislation such as Red, which historically has limited certain ethnic groups from settling and living in certain neighborhoods of San Diego over others, as well as other sort of municipal incentives such as getting the Navy to come to San Diego, thus increasing the Anglo population over population of other migrant workers. Second, after establishing that Anglo hegemony was present in San Diego, my paper goes on to kind of understand how the narrative of San Diego's founding was influenced by this hegemony. It provides evidence that hegemony perpetuated itself in the city's collective memory via the founding narrative. So by emphasizing the actions of Father Junipero Serra and the early European colonial settlers as the founding of the San Diego, it kind of creates a imagined place for Anglo peoples as the rightful rulers of San Diego, or the rightful people to kind of have this cultural presence and domination to kind of justifies their hegemony. And we can see how this kind of influenced the narrative and how the narrative influenced the power. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship. And it's kind of interesting to see kind of that this hegemony had this relationship and unique influence on the narrative. As an example, some of the evidence I used would be newspaper articles. So this one kind of talks about Bishop praises the founder. This is an Anglo bishop who's giving a sermon at the Mission de Alcala at the beginning of the year in 1969 about kind of the celebration of having such a long history of European rule in San Diego, kind of talking about praising the actions of Father Serra. It's a unique kind of look into how thought leaders in San Diego kind of used the narrative of European colonizers as exactly what we were talking about earlier, where we can see the European colonizers as the historical founders and leaders and kind of justifying their presence today as just that. My second section kind of talks about the market influences on the narrative. of San Diego's founding. My paper, the section kind of begins with discussing local businesses and kind of local business owners, particularly Copley, who kind of sponsored historical restorations, events in the city, and then as well as media coverage of the celebrations of 1969. And so we can see like historical restorations of Old Town for the purposes of celebrating and remembering the past. And then we can also see a second part of this, which is the spending allocated by municipal and state government for tourism. So besides private sponsorship and ownership of promotion of the kind of celebratory narratives, we can also see municipal and state government legislation, because this wasn't only seen as San Diego's founding, but also California's founding. And so there was a lot of attempt to garner support for kind of tourism initiatives in San Diego. And this had a really unique influence on how we remember San Diego's founding, in that it wasn't just built on the most historically accurate claims, but rather things that would draw people from other parts of the country to come visit San Diego and spend money and kind of increase tourism revenue. And this had a really profound kind of impact on the narrative, which made it more celebratory for people to come visit and less kind of representative of the hardships of colonial settlers, which doesn't attract tourism as well as kind of parties and celebrations do. And a source example of this would be kind of Old Town San Diego's National Historic Landmark nomination form. This again kind of discusses how San Diego's monuments were important because of their colonial legacy. When you go and read throughout this document, it has a lot of images of the old colonial Victorian style housing, and kind of the justification for it has to do with its proximity to Presidio Park and its founding in San Diego, how the presence of this site was important to be remembered and restored because of its colonial legacy. And then finally, my third section discusses biases in scholarship. This is another unique kind of influence of how we understand the San Diego's founding. The precedent of historiography led to the promotion of colonial narratives. So since Father Serra and his actions have been considered the historical founding of San Diego, a lot of historians and historians after that kind of built upon this legacy and started to find more evidence and had an entire kind of literature around Father Serra himself, and how his actions really led to a unique promotion of San Diego and the legacy of California. But then again, when we are discussing the scholarship of the 1969 time period, it's important to recognize that this kind of colonial literature was not the only one present, but there was also a beginning of more kind of new decolonial narratives that were beginning to carve spaces for marginalized populations. Yet at this time, they didn't share the same sort of priority that the narratives of colonial people did. But again, kind of important to note that this was beginning and at a time of really a lot of change in the United States in the 1960s. It's kind of important to note, but also similarly, just as important to note that the colonial narratives had that kind of staying power over that of the decolonial narratives. And then for the source example, again, for this section, California's Serran literature. So it's kind of this is like an article in Southern California Quarterly, which was still a pretty popular historical journal in San Diego about Southern California. And this is from 1969, and talking about the bicentennial and kind of talking about this importance of Father Serra's history in San Diego and how he was a historical and religious pioneer. Again, we can kind of see how this kind of historical precedent and all of the literature around it led to the promotion of San Diego's founding narrative as a sort of colonial celebration as opposed to more historically accurate and representative. And so finally, what are the outcomes of this kind of research? Now that we kind of have an understanding of how these narratives are created and what kind of influences we can see in the future in creating new narratives, this kind of project hopes to ensure that we have more representative decolonial narratives. And finally, and we can make a new space for marginalized peoples within our academic narratives. And theoretically, this project hopes to elaborate on the rhetorical power of the historiographic process and the influence of monuments on a city's public history. And so how we can see how the influence of the material city around us and the events and monuments of remembrance have a real material influence on who's in power in both economic, cultural, and real, truly systematic ways. Thank you. And I will present. I'm honored to introduce Henry. Henry is majoring in Spanish and computer science. His mentor is Dr. Amanda Peterson in languages, cultures, and literatures. And his research is entitled Using Tech to Reveal the Fictions of Narco-Cultural Productions.
Hey, how's it going? So my name is Henry Tran Quevedo, and I'm a double major in Spanish and computer science. For my project, I work with my mentor and Spanish advisor, Dr. Peterson. The name of the project is Using Tech to Reveal the Fictions of Narco-Cultural Productions. So for my presentation, I wanted to guide the whole thing towards my experience as a Keck Fellow, because for me, the most important aspect of this fellowship is the experience that I obtained, not only the final deliverables that I ended up with. I wanted to give a brief overview of my whole experience of what I thought were the most important phases of my journey. So it's kind of started with the project idea, then the research, findings, implementation, and then the challenges and outcomes. So starting off with the project idea. I briefly mentioned this before in the discussion panel, but I want to say it again because the reason this project means a lot to me is because of how the idea came to be. After talking to Dr. Peterson about possible ideas for the project, I knew that I wanted to combine both of my majors to create something that was relevant to me. At the time, I had just taken a computer science class that revolved around developing apps for iPhones, and I was also watching the new season of Narcos on Netflix with my roommates, and it was something we would always talk about. During these conversations with my roommates that revolved around the series, I noticed that some of the perspectives on Mexico and Latin America had been built around the perspective of violence and drugs that is produced by these type of series like Narcos. However, that was not the only time I had experienced something similar. During my first years of college, recently coming back from Mexico, I encountered that people had similar perspectives, but they necessarily did not have bad intentions. It was just that it was the only thing they were familiar with. For that reason, I wanted to come up with something that could give insight and context that would counter the crime and violence narrative that overshadows Mexico's and many other Latin American countries' beauty and cultural importance. So using the technological skills that I learned from my mobile app class, and because the narco figure was something that I had studied before in my Spanish classes, I thought it was a good idea to combine both, with the purpose of revealing the distinction between truth and fiction in these type of productions. So in terms of research, there was a lot of reading that went from books to articles to even comments and book reviews. Overall, the research was divided into two parts. The first part being the research that revolved around the narco figure in different narco-cultural productions. And the second part was doing research for the application development, the design, the environment, and the specifications. So for this part of the research, it was important to grasp how the narco figure is perceived in different areas and time periods, so I can fully give the context and insight that is behind the narco figure that we see today. Out of all the research that I did, and after realizing that there's a point where I have to stop reading during the research, which is something we would talk about in our monthly meetings, I was able to kind of note down what the most useful literary works were for me. So as you can see here, the first one is called Norte, una antología, which translates to North, an anthology, by Eduardo Antonio Parra. This book has been one of the most important works in my research because it has a collection of unique perspectives on the narco figure that go all the way back from the late 1800s to more recent ones from this decade. Surprisingly for me in this anthology, it has some stories that also tackle the issue of having perspectives that are guided by violence and drugs, and how the authors of these stories kind of want to display like their criticism towards society and how these perspectives come to be. Another and kind of the most obvious works that I study a lot were Narcos and Narcos Mexico on Netflix. Since these series are the most popular out of all the works that I have here, Narcos was the medium through which this research can relate or connect to different people. Since some of the episodes have like over millions of views, I had to find specific episodes that could encapsulate the overall fiction and over-dramatization that is used in the series, so that I can counteract it with historical evidence and facts that I found throughout my readings. Another literary work that was very useful to me is called La Virgen de los Sicarios by Fernando Vallejo. This novel was published in one of the most violent times of Medellin, Colombia, and all of its effects could be seen at its greatest extremity. Since it's one of the most popular books on the subject of the narco figure, this work served to compare certain criticisms of society that were used in the book with similar problems I have faced in my daily life, whether it was in Mexico or in the US. Although these are only a few examples of the works that I studied, they were the most influential in helping me create and connect all of my ideas into a single thesis. The other part of my research revolved around the application development. This part of the research was much more technical, and the biggest thing to do was familiarize myself with the development environment for the operating system called Xcode, which is used for iPhones. Although I did have experience with Xcode in the past in my other classes, there was a few things that I was unfamiliar with and that I had to be explored. So kind of going along with the previous part, I needed to go more in detail and figure out if some of the app ideas that I had were compatible to the Xcode version that I was using to develop the application, which in my case, I was using the Sarah Computer Labs because it was the only space where I can actually do all the updates and tools that I needed because my computer is not good enough. So depending on the version, I needed to adapt to view modifications that revolve around Swift and the UI interface. And lastly, I had to create an app design that I thought looked user-friendly, but at the same time still had the sophistication needed to carry out the tasks that I wanted to implement. So overall, the app development process and research was much more straightforward, since the biggest part of it was getting up to date with the latest releases of Xcode and its tools. So for findings, I just want to give a brief overview for the sake of time. I wanted to mention a recurring theme that kept appearing throughout my research, and it was only until I kept reaching the same conclusion and reading about it 1,000 times that I finally realized how I wanted to connect all the readings I had made. The theme always started with a misconception, something that can be caused by past experiences or exposure to popular media that may not be completely true, something as like the narco figure we see in series such as Narcos, and society and the culture that is portrayed in those type of series. This sometimes and almost always leads to a certain stereotype that may not necessarily be true. And overall, it creates a sense of otherness. And this otherness is being thrown around a lot these days, but I kind of want to like define it as a concept that is given to a group within a society by another group that has greater political power. So this sense of otherness represents disorder, the flux of reordering, and for some, degeneracy. I kind of want to encapsulate all this with one of the stories that is found in the book Norte, which is by Cristina Roscon. And it says, "It's nothing against Mexicans, of course, but the terrorists could cross the Mexican border. Plus, once the wall is done, no more risking their lives. Don't you think so, dear?" The story itself tells how a simple misconception led to the idea of creating this sense of stereotypes and otherness, and how the characters in this story are trying to play around that idea, and the author tries to give her own perspective on how she's dealing with these type of perspective and what we could do at home to try to fight these narratives in a positive way. And I just thought this was a great example of how the main idea that I'm trying to encapsulate is portrayed in a single story. So in terms of implementation, due to the whole COVID-19 situation, I wasn't able to fully implement my application into the iOS design because the lab was closed and I did not have the resources at home to make it. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of how the implementation was supposed to look. So as we could see in this screen, that would be the main screen where people could choose the season they wanted to look at. And depending on the season you chose, the episode scenes were going to be at the bottom. So for example, at the bottom it says, going back to Cali, todos los hombres de Perez and convivir. If a person were to select the first scene, going back to Cali, it would take you to a scene analysis screen. As we can see on the right, the name of the episode is at top with the scene playing right below it. And there are verified facts that can be added depending on what you're trying to, what insight you're trying to give to that scene. It's kind of like a crowdsource funded application. And then people can verify them. And then I could check on the comments. I could like try to give my own insight and just like as a whole, as a community build what we think is, or what we know is facts and what we know is fiction. So I added some of the names of some of my friends and some just comments, some facts that I knew about the series. And I just added some check marks to the right, which means they are verified. Another screens that I wanted to show was a narco questionnaire. I think for me, one of the most important things in terms of this project is realizing how much you don't know about a certain topic. So I thought like a narco questionnaire or some sort of a quiz was the perfect idea to make you realize if whether you knew what the series is trying to portray and what the fiction is and what the reality is, or if you don't know what the truth behind it. So I just made a quick example about some of the elections that occur in the series and how you have a few options, and if you choose the wrong one, then you kind of get an idea of what you think is right and what you think is wrong. Another view that can be in the application was the character analysis, because lots of times the characters in these type of series are kind of romanticized in a way, and I'm trying to show the reality behind it and some of the facts that can lead you to understand the whole perspective of the characters and how the whole story came to be and what the reality of it is. So that's kind of the whole implementation part. I had a few more app designs and like layouts and views, but I cannot fully put in this presentation due to lack of time and some of the things I couldn't do on the Sarah lab. So in terms of challenges, I think for me, and a topic that always came about was scheduling. Since it was a year-long project, I think scheduling for me was definitely one of the harder things, how to meet the deadlines and how to stop reading, how to stop procrastinating, how to deal everything with the work that you had in school, and how to just try to make the most out of the experience. So scheduling was one of the biggest challenges for me. Luckily, I had Dr. Peterson, she showed me how she dealt with her own research and how she planned everything to meet the deadline. And it was something that I found very useful. Then the whole COVID-19 situation, I'm sure it affected everyone. For me personally, since I'm currently not at home and I don't have the resources that I used to have in Sarah Lab, I cannot fully implement the application on the Xcode directly. So the best I could do right now is try to create the design and then just implement it once I have the opportunity, which I think I'm gonna have lots of time to do in the future because it's something I really wanna continue with. In terms of outcomes, I think the mentor relationship I've had with Dr. Peterson and her showing me all her experience and how she does work, and even everyone at the Humanities Center showing me how they approach certain challenges and their solutions and their insight to these problems is something that I think has been the most useful out of the whole experience. And also the hands-on experience I've had at trying to combine both of my majors is something that I thought I was only going to be able to do once I graduated, but it's something I'm doing now, which I'm really thankful for. And I kind of want to end my presentation with this. It's something that I always used to remind myself, or what someone used to ask me, what's the importance of your research? And it's a quote from a Nigerian novelist named Chimamanda Adichie. And she talks about the dangers of a single story. And the quote goes like this: a single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not only that they can be untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make the one story become the only story. I think overall this quote kind of encapsulates the whole idea of what I'm trying to do for my project and why I'm doing it. I'm trying to remove the dangers of a single story. In my sense, it's kind of, I'm trying to overcome the negative perspectives of drugs and violence that is kind of overshadowing my home country and many Latin American countries. And I thought a fun way of doing that, and something that I'm interested in, was doing it with narco culture productions such as Narcos, and doing it in a fun way such as creating an application for it. So yeah, that's a brief overview of my experience, and thank you.
I'd like to be the first to just congratulate all of the fellows on your exceptional work up to this point. It's so amazing that you've been able to persist and to continue focusing all the way through the disruptions that we've experienced, and definitely we're so grateful. Your presentations have been extraordinarily thought-provoking, and I'm really excited to see. We're going to open up for questions, but I want to hopefully make sure that if somebody directly, that we just hear a little bit from each of you about sort of where you see this going, what sort of next steps or trajectory you'd like to see. But let's leave that kind of towards. Let's just hear. Thank you again for those who have signed on, and I'd like to open up for questions. Go ahead. Yes, please, Brian.
Yeah, just a couple of things. First of all, that was all fascinating stuff. Really, really beautifully put together, and you've done so well. It's such a challenging time for all of you to do this, and to be able to produce work of this quality in a way that you can't have been expecting this when you started out. It really is grounds for enormous congratulations for all of you. We're really impressed with you. So first of all, thank you for that. I have a couple of questions, just about stuff. I mean, I feel like a dreadful ignoramus. Your work is far exceeding things that I can understand. But just on some things, first of all, Alexandra, first, I adore your photographs, by the way. It's wonderful. I'd love to have been able to see them in the flash, as you were saying.
Thank you.
Interested in the title and what your judgment is about the fate of the concept of the sublime as a means of evaluating art and landscape now. Do you feel yourself falling into the category of those people who now say that the sublime is a sort of dead concept? It doesn't have any application at all. And if not, where is it to be found now?
So I guess I would argue that there's sublime in cities in the Southern California. I wouldn't say that they're as sublime more inland. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question? What kind of things would be evocative now of the sublime for you? I think a lot of it's just the idea of walking through a city. I mean, if you're walking through a city in New York or Chicago, it's flooded with people. There's a lot of street photographers and a lot of emotion that's being evoked. And I think that walking around cities in LA and San Diego, you don't really get that kind of sense. It's a lot more emptied, and you see the beauty of architectures. Obviously it's their work and they put so much time and effort into making these buildings, but they're just not being put to work. And that's just kind of that fear in the sublime. You have to question, it's not as much of nature being the beauty like Ansel Adams and everything. It's more of the fear of this kind of way where we're headed into a more futuristic kind of society.
Yeah, very interesting. There's this great passage in Burke where he's talking about how the sense of the sublime is produced through our senses, and one of it is straining to look up at a very, very tall thing, and there's such a tension in the optic nerves and the fibers of the eye that it produces this sort of dizzying sense of terror. I suppose one could get that by looking up at these very, very tall buildings. But you are right to say, I think, that the urban landscape we now have it doesn't obviously lend itself to that. It was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. It was so invigorating. Thank you.
Thanks.
Jesse, do you have time for one more question? Or
Yes, absolutely.
Cooper, I was very sad we never really got to speak about your work in person, because I know we were going to do that, and then, you know, something unnameable. I'm interested in what your reading of Freud is in the midst of all of this. Freud's obviously very, his legacy is an ambiguous one. You know, everywhere in terms of how we understand politics post-Freud. You know, there's the radical Freud that leads on to, you know, heroes of yours like Marcuse.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the much more conservative Freud that's emphasizing human aggressivity, imperfection, and so on, that people like Philip Reef, and I probably think Freud himself is in that camp, as well as this, how the idea of human nature as being something which could be perfected or just restrained, and how that plays out in different modes of psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
What's your reading of Freud here? Is he someone to enlist on the radical side, or is he a conservative figure?
That's a good question. I don't know. He's basically become to the point where in religious studies, we talk about religious figures as being sort of battleground sites, you know, where, say you take Jesus. Nowadays, you know, people just use Jesus as a place to argue for their own views. And I think someone who was as influential as Freud could be viewed at pretty similarly. Definitely, like in my research, like the way that I kept kind of bumping up against him was this, like, Freud's idea that introspection is basically impossible, that it's impossible to really know yourself and to really change your unconscious. And of course, like contemplative like philosophers and contemplative traditions sort of go against that. But when you compare him to Bernays, I mean, he just seemed to me like an extremely benevolent figure. I mean, he may have had some conservative leanings, but it also seemed that, like, he was almost so pessimistic that he really had a deep sense of empathy for people and was just trying to help them. The fact that maybe he understood people so well and never used it against people, but only to help people, makes me think of him as you know, generally a pretty good guy. Maybe not a revolutionary guy the way Marcuse reads him, but at least someone to keep in mind. And I think that he's also important when considering like the contemplative side, because at the very least, Freud proves that it's really, really hard to know yourself, right? And so it's impossible to just say we're rational and we know everything that's going on in our minds because of what Freud did. And I think that the contemplative traditions also bring an aspect of that as well. They say it's really hard. It takes hard work to know yourself. It doesn't just happen. Basically, autonomy is not a default setting. So if it's possible, you need to work really hard. So he's somebody I'm super interested in, something I'm going to keep looking into. But I don't know if that quite answered your question.
It did. It was a great answer. Really great answer to the question.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think the truly disturbing things about Freud is the thing about the inability to know yourself. And as Janet Malcolm brilliantly puts it, the most disturbing idea in Freud is not Oedipus complex or all that stuff. It's your inability truly to connect with another person. You can never know them because of the transference of projection. So I think that's the area, the restraining in of knowledge. I also just agree with, I think Freud's a great way to think about this particular time. The things you started out your presentation with about the protests and how one can read this in a Freudian way about the id being unleashed, the need for immediate gratification, the painful effects of the superego sense of what you really need to be doing as opposed to what you want to be doing in this moment. So if ever there was a time for Freud to be brought out of this kind of obscurity that we've insisted on throwing him into, this is the moment, and you might be the guy to do this. So thank you, it's brilliant, I loved it.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jesse, that took up a lot of time.
That was beautiful. We're still good. We're still within our time frame. And I'd actually like to ask a question of Noah. So I would like to just hear you maybe just talk a little bit more about the accessibility of sources, just how you felt about, just being able to find sources from the 1960s. And then maybe if you were able to find, because this is, again, at the sort of this very potent moment of various civil rights movements, including an American Indian movement, and and clearly very aggressive challenges to sort of like these sort of colonial recolonizing kind of state norms. So were you able to find any specific sources where there was a lot of pushback against the imagination of history that came from sort of almost canonizing or deifying the past that was used to justify these, what makes these sites historically significant?
Yeah, surely. I think I was troubled in finding local sources of like activists on the ground and their actions in kind of promoting anti-colonial narratives, but the sources that I have been using were kind of like ethnographic and academic more so than they were physical, like material kind of actions and protests. It's one of the things I kind of had difficulty finding sources with, because the accessible sources from 1960s are like a lot of the things in this San Diego Historical Center, San Diego History Center, and as well as like the California Room in the San Diego Downtown Library. And those have all of the newspaper records of the major newspapers of the time, which were like fairly conservative. So they really kind of didn't have the activist notions. There were a few articles relating to activist movements, but they weren't as like passionate as like what something would be from somebody who's trying to make the argument themselves.
Yeah, anyone want to comment on sort of what step you would like to take next, or yeah, where you to go next with these projects, if they're going to continue, or where you would like to go as a scholar?
I've been talking with Dr. Mueller in the San Diego History. He is the editor for the San Diego History Journal. So I'm seeing if I can try to get something that would be relevant for that journal, or if not that journal, some other relevant application. So I think it's kind of going to be an interesting process, because my paper is about double the length of a journal entry. So as it currently sits, so I'll be kind of just editing it down, hoping to get it to some kind of point where it can have a greater dissemination.
I was planning on maybe taking that sort of bit from the beginning of my presentation about the stay-at-home protests and turning it into sort of a short form piece, just kind of using some of the analysis tools that I picked up during my research, using it for some job applications, and then hopefully maybe trying to publish it online somewhere. But maybe more broadly, I just learned that I had a real love for reading the sort of psychological and philosophical works, and that's pointed me towards a more specific avenue of studying religion in the future, hopefully for graduate school. So the project will likely continue on there if everything goes according to plan.
So I've actually been wanting to go, because I explored the Southern California, so I actually wanted to continue going up the West Coast into the Northern California areas, just kind of like compare and contrast, because the California dream to market people coming here versus the South and the North. And then I've also, since quarantine, been taking pictures of homes, I guess, and kind of looking at like nicer neighborhoods and seeing how one house styles it one way and then one house styles it in another. I think that's an interesting way to explore, because in cities it's kind of more of a broader and bigger scope, but then in houses it's more of an individual person, how one person wants to be perceived, kind of more of that notion of front stage self versus like who you actually are backstage self. So I think I want to look down those alleys in the future.
For the master's program I applied to, when I submitted my application, it seemed like they were really interested of the research I was currently doing in undergrad. And I think I'm trying to keep on developing the ideas that I have now, and maybe try to mix in something with like cybersecurity in Latin America or Mexico, and kind of like keep on going with the ideas that I have now and what I'm doing to combine both of my majors. So that's something I'm looking forward to in my graduate studies.
Well, thank you again, all. We're just so happy we're celebrating, we're just sitting in joy with your accomplishments. These are truly tremendous accomplishments. To reiterate that point, we're very, very proud of you, and we're happy that in this discombobulated and challenging moment that you've represented so strongly the power and force of your own ideas, of your work with your mentors, your faculty mentors, and the possibilities of how important our upcoming generations of scholars are in helping us understand the terrain that we're going into.